Let's talk now about the Mexican Republic, because this grew out of the Spanish Empire and saw effectively the end of most of the Spanish missions. And the theme here is that independence from Spain created an environment for the Rancho era. Think of all those lands that the missions had developed, tens of thousands of acres. And they belong, by and large, to the church. But what happens if you have a government that comes in and sees the church not as a support mechanism, as the Spanish Empire saw it, but on the contrary, sees the church as an enemy, or at least an institution that needs to be subdued? There are several important dates here. September 4th, 1781, the date of the founding of Los Angeles, with Felipe de Neve settling those 44 pobladores who came up from Mexico. Another important date is 1821, the beginning of the Mexican Republic, in which Mexico finally broke away from Spain and sought to establish a new form of government in the area. And a third is 1834, because 1834 is the official proclamation of the secularization of the missions. There's a tendency among many historians to want to romanticize this era, that the Rancho days were ones of happiness and gaiety, of people dancing fandangos and playing on guitars, of large ranchos with wealthy elite enjoying parties and endless sunshine. And part of that certainly has a basis in truth, but this is also for the mass of the population who lived under these missions and the ranches was an extremely harsh kind of life, which we've already detailed with mission life. And so there is this desire to break away from Spain, to create a republic, and to establish for the Indians an entirely new kind of life in which you would guarantee land to the Indians. In other words, land to those who had actually made the land prosper. So one of the main goals of the new Mexican government of the Republic after 1821 is to secularize the missions, to break them up, and to create these large ranchos where Indians could finally work the land. When Jose Figueroa, the governor of Mexico, announces in August of 1834 that the missions will now be secularized, the idea was to enact a plan that had been in place for over 20 years. There had been talk of secularizing the missions based on long-standing grievances and concerns that the missions were not as successful as they had hoped in terms of attraction of Indians, concerns of subjugation, of abuse. So ever since 1813, there had been efforts to begin talking about secularizing the missions. Once the Mexican Republic is founded, now one can actually take those plans and try to put them into place. The problem, though, is how do you persuade the Franciscan priests themselves that this is a plan worth pursuing? Because the Franciscan priests are there on the ground and are assumedly supposed to be part of the mechanism to secularize the missions. And part of the problem is the priests were most certainly not in favor of the secularization. So that sets up a conflict. They certainly were not supportive of the democratic parliament that had formed in Mexico City, which they often tend to see as the work of the devil. And so they did everything they could to put off secularization. And that resistance made it even more difficult to try to put into place. What it did provide, though, was ultimately not land to the Indians, but rather land to wealthy elites. These tended to be the former officers of the Mexican military, or a Spanish descendant or claiming Spanish descendant, elite or family wealth, and receiving land grants of tens of thousands of acres. Land that the missions had to a great extent developed, not entirely, but to a great extent. And the Indians would then work as laborers, effectively as sharecroppers, on that land. And so we have this hierarchy that is put into place of what historians have called, and what they themselves called, the Californios, or the Californians themselves, of which the wealthy elite were the landowners, and the great mass of the population, which was largely Indian, on the surface Christianized, and they would become the laborers to try to make this new system, the Rancho era system, work. And if we look at the 700 land grants that were in place during the era of secularization, we see families growing rich off of the cattle industry, the agriculture industry, and to some extent trade with Americans on the east side of the continent. And yes, we do see a kind of social life of dances like the yota and the waltz and the polka, this kind of European influence. We do see a close interlinking between these Californio families. But we also see clear abuse and exploitation of those who are actually working the land. And in a reading about a famous trial on Guadalupe Trujillo, we see some of those complaints and grievances taking shape.